First Nations leaders across BC are calling for a public inquiry into the deaths of several Indigenous people at the hands of police. The outcry follows the province's decision to not pursue legal action against RCMP officers involved in the death of a Wet'suwet'en man, Jared Lowndes. The Campbell River man died in July 2021 after he was pursued by RCMP officers who attempted to subdue him with a police dog, a taser, and gunshots. Lowndes was 38 years old. Lauren Holland, the mother of Jared Lowndes, says the fight isn't over, vowing to seek justice not just for Jared, but for all Indigenous people killed by police officers.
We knew that everything that they did that day was wrong. This is the beginning of a fight that's going to last a long time. This is the beginning of a fight where we are going to ask for changes to policies. We're going to ask for changes to laws because there have been far too many Indigenous people being shot and killed, maimed, murdered by the RCMP and different police forces across Canada.
Following his death, BC's police watchdog, the Independent Investigations Office, found reasonable grounds exist to believe that 3 officers may have committed offences in relation to various uses of force. On April 23rd, the BC Prosecution Service ruled against the watchdog's findings, citing insufficient evidence. The province declaring they would not be pursuing a case against the officers in question. The decision caused public outrage, with the First Nations Council stating the RCMP continue to evade charges for killing First Nations people. The Indigenous community says this is just one of many cases of justice not being served. To break down the prevalence of deaths amongst Indigenous people at the hands of police officers, I'm joined in studio by Nima Rajan.
Thank you, Adrienne. Now, Tracking Injustice Canada is an organization that collates data on police-involved killings across the country. And this is what their research shows. Take a look. Indigenous people are overrepresented in the numbers of police use of force-involved deaths. In fact, nationwide, Indigenous people are the racial group most likely to die from police brutality. City News acknowledges that the terminology surrounding the reporting of these deaths is political in and of itself. The numbers here show deaths that have occurred in incidents that involve police force, but often these findings aren't upheld by the courts. In fact, it's the very reason behind the recent calls for a public inquiry from First Nations leaders in BC. A little more on that later, but provincially, on a provincial level, 22 Indigenous people have died from police-involved incidents in BC. In fact, community members suggest that the number may be higher. According to a report into racial prejudice by Tracking Injustice, Indigenous people are 8 times more likely to die in police incidents than white people. Now, the data fluctuates on a year-over-year basis, but these racial disparities have remained largely consistent over the past 2 decades, Adrienne. So in summary, that data shows that Indigenous people are dying at an alarming rate. Back to you.
Thank you, Nima. The rise of deaths is a cause for concern for Indigenous people who say a fear of the RCMP is common amongst the community. Advocates say not enough is being done to pursue justice. The First Nations Leadership Council says the RCMP continues to evade charges for killing First Nations people. The council joins calls for a public inquiry into the crisis. For more on this, I'm joined in studio by BC Regional Chief of the First Nations Leadership Council, Terry Teegee. Terry, thanks so much for joining us here today. What was the community's reaction to the decision not to pursue a case against the officers involved in the killing of Jared Lowndes?
Well, certainly it's a sense of frustration, and I think, you know, this is not anything new because we've experienced this for many, many years. And certainly I think we mirror the call from the Independent Investigations Office and call for a public inquiry in regards to why many police officers aren't seen to be coming to justice. Certainly many families, including my own, are left with frustration and unanswered questions, and really I think back in the community, that's what we really feel.
Just heartbreaking. And in speaking of families, in the wake of the prosecutions service's decision not to pursue legal action, Jared's mother has put out a statement, and she says, "I don't know where to start. I have relived the day my son died, replayed what I've heard and been told secondhand. Over and over, I've been told that the police were fearful for their lives. They were fearful when they rammed into his vehicle. They were fearful when they released a police service dog into his car. They were fearful when they shot my son repeatedly. I've held the clothes he wore that day. I've seen the bullet holes. Every step of the way, I've had to fight to hold those clothes, to hold police and government accountable. That fight won't stop." Those are some very powerful words from his mother. What goes through your mind when you hear that?
Well, yeah, Jared's mother certainly encapsulated what many feel in the community, and also many of the close loved ones in regards to the death in custody of many of our Indigenous peoples. Jared, Dale Culver in Prince George, also Everett Patrick, who's a relative of mine. And we've seen this across Canada as well, in terms of Chantal Moore, a Cleaman woman in New Brunswick who was shot by the New Brunswick police in a wellness check during the pandemic. So that statement by Jared's mom certainly resonates with many families out there, and you can sense the outcry of seeking justice, and also her frustration, but also the fight to seek some semblance of justice for her loved one.
And just trying to make sense of it all. And the National Police Federation has also released a statement. They said they welcome the Crown's decision to exonerate the Campbell River police officers, stating, "Our members have endured almost 3 years of uncertainty since they were forced to defend themselves and their community." What's your reaction to hearing that statement?
Well, I think it really speaks to the brotherhood, if you will, of policing, but I think we're really frustrated in terms of these cases. The excessive use of force, which caused death. I think, one of the things that we really got to think about here is that is the level of force too much, and certainly in these cases they are. So it speaks to the amount of training that policing are getting, and also if they're well equipped in many of these cases, because in the end, I think, if police are trained well, or if there are more consequences to these types of excessive use of force, then these cases won't happen again. But in the end, it speaks to how much training that the police have. In the end, I think what we're really thinking about here and talking about here is finding some semblance of justice. But also further to that is how policing occurs within urban centers, within First Nations communities, and if the use of force is appropriate.
Absolutely. And before we get into talking about Indigenous-led policing, Tracking Injustice reports 22 Indigenous people have died as a result of police violence in BC. Do you think that number is a true reflection?
Well, yeah, I think it is a true reflection, perhaps even higher if you include a lot of, First Nations that are injured. But also further to that, I think it really speaks to the amount of First Nations that have died in custody. Far too often, as in this case, we're overrepresented in terms of statistics. And I think it's not just here in British Columbia, it's across Canada.
And the history with the RCMP obviously dates very far back. But what is the sentiment in the community when it comes to police interactions? Is there fear there?
Well, to this day, there's a mistrust with the RCMP. I mean, in our First Nations communities, we call them in our dialect Nulchuckin. And you translate that into Dakat, and what that means to English is those who take us away. And that's our reflection on the RCMP, because they were the people that took our children away to residential schools. So right from the beginning, RCMP was there to take us off our lands, dispossess our people from our lands where we used to hunt, where we used to really practice our culture. And since the beginning, there has been a mistrust with the RCMP to this day, where we've seen many reports from Indigenous women not trusting the RCMP in the cases such as what was reported by the Tyee news in regards to policing and the RCMP in the Vanderhoof area. And that's not unusual. That occurs elsewhere too, in Prince George, rural areas, and in and around British Columbia, and in Canada. There's a real mistrust with the RCMP.
And what has the community reaction been as well in terms of the calls for a public inquiry? What are you hearing in the community?
Well, I think from the community, it's certainly supported. We want to have some answers about why the BC Crown Prosecutor's Office hasn't really proceeded as indicated by the Independent Investigations Office to go ahead with charges in some of these cases. Perhaps maybe it is because of evidence, I don't know, but nevertheless there seems to be an unusually high number of cases where charges aren't proceeding to the court through the court system, and we need to find out those answers. And perhaps it really speaks to the Crown Prosecutor's Office. Perhaps it should be an independent office outside of the government, and as we've seen in places like Alberta, where there's an arm's length Crown Prosecutor's Office that will oversee some of these charges.
And speaking of places like Alberta, federally and provincially, there have been a lot of changes to the Police Act there to allow more powers to Indigenous police forces. Is that something, I mean, you've mentioned the mistrust with the RCMP that dates back decades. Let's talk a little bit more about Indigenous-led policing and what that looks like here in BC, and what impact would that have in situations like this?
Well, we have one police force in the Statlium territory that have their own police force. There we have about 52, 53 tripartite agreements with the RCMP. But across this country, we do have many First Nations-led RCMP forces that take care of policing within the community. The problem there is that much of it is provided by the federal and provincial government, and far too often from the federal government it is program funding. So First Nations and many of these police forces don't know how much funding they're going to get in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. We currently are working on legislation to make it an essential services funding, which will not only give more funding to these police forces, but also predictable funding. But the problem is there really is an issue with jurisdiction where the federal government wants to draw down the jurisdiction of the policing to the provincial and territorial governments. We see it in light of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples that jurisdiction should come down to the First Nations communities, to our governments, in regards to how I would say, the levels of I think acknowledgement of government as First Nations governance should be taken over jurisdiction. It's very similar to what we've experienced the last several years with child welfare, where the federal government wanted to draw down jurisdiction to provincial and territorial governments. We said no, First Nations should be leading that. And then this is a very similar case where jurisdiction should come to the First Nations.
And under very new as well, so still figuring all of that out. But what else needs to change in terms of government policy?
Well, I think in terms of this province, the province of BC, we're working through the updating of the Police Act. I certainly believe within the Police Act itself in the province of BC should align with the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, Bill C-41, which is provincial law here. Further to that, the United Nations Declaration Act, which is federal law, should also align with the declaration, and certainly as part of that, I think the justice system and the policing system needs to acknowledge the declaration and First Nations governance to really change the systemic issues that First Nations are experiencing within judicial and policing system.
Well, do you have anything else to add in terms of looking ahead to any of these changes?
Well, certainly working perhaps with this provincial government, I think we're calling upon a meeting with the Attorney General and also the Solicitor General to look at if there's a possibility for, no, not a possibility, that we want a public inquiry. And further to that, it is working with all levels of government. And also many police forces. You know, there's the Vancouver Police, there's many municipal police out there to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And certainly as a family member, you've spoke of Jared's mother, it's heartbreaking. It's really, I think, there is no justice and there is no ability to keep any police force accountable right now. That's the way we feel, and it's frustrating.
So still lots and lots of work to be done. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us here today. Very much appreciate it. That was Regional Chief Terry Teegee with the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations on calls for a public inquiry into the handling of police brutality cases against Indigenous people in the province. What are your thoughts? Do you support calls for a public inquiry into police-involved killings of Indigenous people? Email us at vancouver@citynews.ca. City News 24/7 will keep you informed as this story develops. Stay with us. The news continues next.